When you have a wrestler who's on the cusp of greatness, someone who's ready to break out that next level and become a true superstar, all it takes to get them there is a little push. It's what bookers have done for decades after all, gauging what the audience are craving and giving it to them with just the right performer at just the right time. But what happens when that performer isn't the right one? What happens when they fail to get over in the way people had hoped? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Dropping the Ball, wrestling's biggest failed pushes. And where better to start than with one of the most recent examples of a failed push, because despite getting over as a comedy mid-card team act with Tucker in the later 2010s, Otis's push to the top of the card as Mr. Money in the Bank would not go so well. But this one wasn't really his fault, as prior to that, Nikola Bojajevic, the man behind the gimmick, had gotten himself over with fans for his entertaining babyface antics that saw him get involved in a Beauty and the Beast storyline with Mandy Rose. And like that story, this one would see the more attractive Rose eventually fall for her suitor too, leading to one of the high points of WWE TV in early 2020. So it only made sense then that after this, Otis would be given a push, with it all beginning at that year's Money in the Bank pay-per-view when he won the titular ladder match to earn himself a shot at the WWE title. Of course, this would usually be a giveaway that he was going to be champion before long. However, with so much of Otis's appeal being wrapped up in the way fans had reacted to him, and with this taking place during the global shutdown, somewhere along the way, the magic got lost. That was why, not long after his new favorite toy won the briefcase, Vince McMahon would get cold feet as he suddenly decided that Otis's comedy stylings were no longer having the same effect. Sure, he could have changed tracks and pushed him as more of an amateur-style athlete, something which the Money in the Bank holder had actually been prior to entering WWE. Instead, though, the boss decided to put him into a feud with The Miz and John Morrison where, over the next few months, they would repeatedly try and ultimately succeed in stealing the briefcase away from him. And to make matters worse, by then, Mandy Rose was nowhere to be seen in the whole storyline, with it feeling now like any of the momentum from that whole event had dissipated into nothing. So once Tucker, jealous of his partner's solo success, turned on him in late 2020, Otis would sink back down to the mid-card tag team division when he formed a new duo with his real-life close friend, Chad Gable. And while this wouldn't allow him to reach the same peaks he briefly had during the summer prior, it would give him a continued role on the show going forward, so he can at least be thankful for that. One person who didn't get a second chance when his big push failed, though, would have come around a couple of decades prior to this as, back in 2002, Nathan Jones would quickly crash and burn. That said, it's not hard to see why Vince McMahon wanted to give him the initial opportunity as, with a prior career as both a strongman and an MMA fighter, Jones checked all the right boxes for a big push at that time. Unfortunately for him, however, while he did have the look, what he didn't have were the skills, as upon being put in the ring for a number of dark matches on SmackDown in 2002, it would quickly become apparent that he was failing to pull off even simple moves. Still, stubborn as always, the boss felt that if he just put the Australian in the right position, he could make a star out of him regardless. And that position, as it happened, was supposed to be as part of a tag team with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 19 against The Big Show and A-Train. As any aficionados of the streak will know, however, this was the year where the Deadman ended up taking on both opponents in a handicap match, with this decision being made at the last minute after Vince finally realized he couldn't put Jones in the ring at his biggest show of the year, otherwise he'd risk fans laughing it out of the building. So, sending him down to the company's then developmental territory, Ohio Valley Wrestling, for a while, it was hoped that the rookie would be able to improve enough so as to make a splash on the main roster when he returned. But of course, while he would return eventually, he'd never make that splash, and by December of 2003, he'd have parted ways with the company altogether, leaving the whole thing to be something both parties probably wish they could have forgotten. And this wasn't the only failed push which WWE probably wishes they could forget about, as over the years, there have been several more examples, with perhaps none being as prominent as King Mabel. Why was this one so prominent? Well, back in 1995, Mabel wasn't just getting a push to rise up to a higher spot on the card. No, he was getting a push that was supposed to see him enter the world title scene and maybe even end up winning the belt in the process. It all began in 1993. That was when Nelson Frazier first joined WWF with his partner Robert Horn, with the two being renamed as Mabel and Mo, Men on a Mission. And while this would be a fairly successful tag team for the next couple of years, it wasn't until 1995 that, feeling the burn of his lack of main event stars, Vince McMahon decided he was going to push Mabel as his next monster heel. How would he do this? By having him win King of the Ring that June, in a moment that was supposed to fully solidify his move up the card. Unfortunately though, with this being right in the middle of arguably WWF's worst period creatively, and with it also taking place in Philadelphia, the home of ECW, the hardcore fanbase in attendance would loudly reject the whole thing, raining down boos on the new King of the Ring as he accepted his crown that night. And it wouldn't get much better from there either, because by SummerSlam that August, when Mabel got his first shot to take on then WWF champion Diesel, he would almost find himself getting fired when, after delivering an unsafe sit-down splash to the lower back of the champ, McMahon would become enraged and would have to be talked down from giving the heel challenger his marching orders once he came back through the curtain. Needless to say then, following this, Mabel's star would fall, and by 1996, he'd be gone from the company altogether. But while he would eventually return a couple of years later as Viscera, the same can't be said for others, because despite managing to reinvent himself over an Impact recently as W. Morrissey, Big Cass is still yet to make a WWE comeback following his failed push and subsequent release. And why did his time in New York go so wrong? Well, to answer that, we really have to go back to his run as a tag team with Enzo starting in the mid-2010s, because it was this that initially got him over in a big way down in NXT. Yes, with Cass acting as the muscle and Enzo playing the role of the hype man, the duo perfectly complemented each other during their run in NXT between 2013 and 2016. Then, once that was over, they'd continue on in much the same vein when they were called up to the main roster after that. Unfortunately though, by 2017, feeling that the act had run its course, Vince McMahon would decide to split Enzo and Cass up, with the aim here being to take the big man and turn him into the company's next main event heel. So now, without anyone to talk for him, a big weakness of Cass's was exposed to the world as, whenever he was given a mic, he struggled. But still, that didn't mean he had to be a flop, as just having him play the monster heel in the ring would surely be enough to get him over as a singles main eventer. Well, that's what WWE thought, with them going as far as to pair him up with Daniel Bryan at one point with the hopes that the American Dragon would be able to impart some of his wisdom onto him. Sadly though, it seems like this was what eventually led to things falling apart completely, as after reportedly going off script during a segment on SmackDown when he beat up a little person dressed as Bryan, Cass would find himself being released from his contract. And he wouldn't be the only person suffering the same fate around this time, as elsewhere on SmackDown, CARA's time with WWE was finally coming to an end too. This one though was pretty much cursed from the start, because despite being an incredibly skilled luchador who worked down in Mexico as Místico early in his career, when Luis Alverde made the jump over to New York in 2009, he'd instantly struggled to adapt to the American style. And this was a particular shame, because with the company searching for their next Rey Mysterio at this point, Sin Cara, as he had been then rebranded, would have been a made man if he could have just gotten used to the WWE style. But that, of course, would not happen, as upon making his main roster debut in 2011, he'd quickly gain a reputation for botching moves regularly, something which turned him into a bit of a laughingstock with fans. So bad did it get, in fact, that at one point, the company tried to replace Alverde under the mask with Jose Rodriguez, only for them to find out that he wasn't able to pull off the role particularly well either. Yes, it seemed like the role was cursed no matter who was playing it, and in the end, this would lead to the original Sin Cara leaving the company in 2014 so as to return to Mexico, all while the second man behind the mask rebranded himself as Único for a while. And while this would give him a role on the show, it was a far cry from the main event Rey Mysterio-style luchador the company had originally envisioned for the character, with this probably resulting in it being one of the biggest failed pushes in modern WWE history. Of course, it wasn't the only time someone came into Vince McMahon's backyard with a lot of buzz behind them that would fail to translate to a big-time push, as, despite being the son of the legendary Curt Hennig, Curtis Axel's time in WWE would not see him reach the same heights. Still, it wasn't like the company didn't try with him. as after joining the main roster as a member of the Nexus in 2010, it felt like he had all the potential in the world. So when the group failed, WWE would send him back down to NXT for further seasoning, with them eventually calling him up again in 2013 as the newest Paul Heyman guy. Yes, this was during the period where, with Heyman already managing both Brock Lesnar and CM Punk, Vince McMahon had hoped to give the same rub to more performers on the cusp of reaching that level. And so it happened then that after scoring a victory over Triple H upon his re-debut, AXEL would continue on with his upward momentum from there, with him pretty quickly finding himself challenging for the Intercontinental title. Of course, this was the same title that his father had held years prior, so when the newest Paul Heyman guy took on The Miz and Wade Barrett in a triple threat match at June 2013's Payback, it felt all the more special when he picked up the eventual win. Unfortunately though, like Ryback and Cesaro, two other Paul Heyman guys who failed to reach the next level in WWE, Curtis Axel would soon find himself floundering, as with fans not really getting behind him and it becoming more and more apparent that his in-ring skills couldn't quite match up to his dad's, the Intercontinental Champion would begin falling down the card once more. And this would ultimately see him part ways with Heyman as, after losing his belt to Big E in November of that year, he'd move on to the tag team division, first by forming a duo with Ryback himself, and then later by forming another brief one with Damien Sandow. After that, he'd become a member of the Social Outcasts, WWE's premier jobber stable at the time, showing just how far he'd slipped. But he wasn't the only former Nexus member whose star never shone quite as brightly as others may have hoped, because right as Axelmania was rising and falling, elsewhere on the show, Ezekiel Jackson was struggling to even get out of first gear. Of course, when we say that he was a former Nexus member, we are cheating slightly because, rather than be part of the original group, Guyanan-born superstar Rickland Stevens would instead be a part of the Core, the splinter cell of ex-Nexus members who came together after CM Punk had taken the main group over in 2010. But that wasn't Jackson's first run on the main roster, because prior to this, Vince McMahon had been preparing him for a big push by having him play the role of Brian Kendrick's bodyguard on SmackDown for a while, all before sending him down to ECW, where he would become that brand's final champion. So when he was moved back up to the Blue brand following this, and was later announced as the newest member of the Core, it looked like he was finally about to reach the next level. In the end though, while he would still get a push, it wouldn't be as part of the heel stable, as in a last-minute swerve, Wade Barrett would kick Jackson out of the group, causing the rookie to turn babyface and go after his now former friend's Intercontinental title instead. Then at July 2011's Capital Punishment pay-per-view, he would finally get to strap this gold around his waist when he beat Barrett in just over 6 minutes, with it from there looking like his time had come at last. But unfortunately, this would represent the high point of Ezekiel Jackson's run, because despite having the approval of the boss, he just didn't catch on with fans, and so, after 51 days of holding the secondary title, he'd drop it to Cody Rhodes. Following this then, he'd mill around in the undercard for a while, all up until he parted ways with WWE in 2014, never to return again as of the time of this video's recording. And he's not the only failed push who left and never returned, as this was also the case with our next entry, and that's Karma. Of course, current fans may know Karma better as Awesome Kong, female powerhouse previously seen in the likes of TNA, Ring of Honor, and briefly AEW. And if you don't know her from any of these, then you might know her as Kia Stevens, the woman who played the role of Tammy Dawson in the Netflix series Glow to much acclaim. During her time with WWE in 2011, however, she would go by a different moniker, with that being Karma. And hoping to make a quick impact upon her debut that April, she'd start mowing through a number of Divas champions on the roster, with her intention being to prove that the era of the Diva was over and the era of Karma had begun. However, any momentum she was building would be halted when, just 1 month later, she'd reveal that she was going to have to take some time away from the ring as she'd discovered she was pregnant. The following year, Karma would return for one night only for a guest spot in the 2012 Royal Rumble match. Tragically though, Karma would go through a lot of personal issues involving the birth of her child and would later be released from the promotion. This all meant that Awesome Kong would never be seen in a WWE ring again following this, something which we feel is a crying shame, as had her push gotten a chance to be restarted when she was ready to return, she could easily have been a top star in the women's division. One person who was never going to be a top star in WWE, though, no matter how much the company might have wanted it, would have been getting the failed singles push on Raw a few years prior to this. That's right, we're about to go into the sad tale of Rob Conway. Of course, before this, Conway had gone through a relatively successful run as part of La Resistance, a French-Canadian heel team which also included Rene Dupree and Sylvain Grenier. Once that ran its course in 2005, however, Vince McMahon would decide he saw Rob Conway as the breakout star of the group, with him then deciding it was time to see if he could fly solo. And given that he had the look and the natural heelish charisma to make the narcissistic villain gimmick work, it should have been an easy route to the top then. Well, unfortunately, there was one key aspect of the presentation which pretty much hobbled the up-and-comer before he could get going. Now, when it comes to wrestling theme songs, there's a scale. On one end of that scale, we have the likes of Edge's Metalingus, CM Punk's Cult of Personality, or Jeff Hardy's No More Words that are easy to sing along to and which always get fans excited. On the other end of the scale, we have Brie Bella's Brie Mode, Uncle Cracker's X Factor monstrosity, and Rob Conway's bizarre choice for entrance music, Look at Me. Yes, whoever thought it was a good idea to give anyone a Randy Newman-style piano jingle as an entrance song must have been crazy, because this is the oral embodiment of how to kill a fan reaction anytime someone walks through the curtain. So with this albatross already hanging around his neck before he'd even hit the ring, Rob Conway would find himself struggling to get over as a singles act in the weeks and months that followed. He would try, of course, most notably during his brief feuds with a number of WWE legends such as Greg the Hammer Valentine, Doink the Clown, and Coco Beware. That said, it quickly became apparent that things were not going as management had hoped it might, and so, after failing to win the Intercontinental title from Ric Flair, Conway would begin a lengthy losing streak, with this seeing him fall even further and further down the pecking order in the months that followed. Yes, it was a quick fall for the French-Canadian sympathizer, but in his defense, he never really had a chance. One person who can't use this argument, though, would come a couple of years later, as it was in 2008 that Vladimir Kozlov would get his shot at reaching the big time. And for him, this meant a major push early on, as being everything the boss was looking for physically in a superstar, Oleg Prudis, the man behind the character, would make an impact during his initial weeks on the roster by coming down to the ring in complete darkness, with no entrance music and only a spotlight to light his path forward. And once he hit the ring, he'd demolish a series of lower card talent with names such as Funaki, Nunzio, Shannon Moore, and Jamie Noble all feeling his wrath. But Vladimir Kozlov wasn't content with just beating up members of the undercard. No, he wanted to go after bigger fish, and that was why, starting in September of 2008, he'd get better competition when he picked up a win over The Undertaker, all before finding himself in the WWE title scene chasing then-champion Triple H. Of course, he wasn't the only one looking for a shot at the gold, as Jeff Hardy and Edge were also trying to stake their own claims at the same time. And in the end, when Kozlov did eventually get his shot at the game at November's Survivor Series, it would be in a match which also included Edge, with it being the rated R superstar who ended up coming out of it the winner. But while failing to win the world title was something Kozlov could have recovered from, failing to get over with fans was another thing entirely, and that was why in the weeks and months following this, Kozlov would begin to slip down the card, with him getting into feuds with the likes of Matt Hardy, all before he was moved down to the ECW roster to become a part of the Ruthless Roundtable alongside William Regal and Ezekiel Jackson. After that, while he would return to the main roster, he'd never recover, as by then he'd be placed into a mid-card comedy role with Santino Marella, at one point taking part in Marella's genuinely hilarious Tea Party for Sheamus segment on Raw. So while he may never have got to go where he hoped he might have, he did keep a role on the show going forward up until his release in 2011. And as far as where he ranks on the list of failed pushes, let's just say they all could have been more had the circumstances been different. Who knows? Maybe somewhere in a parallel universe, Rob Conway became the face of Raw and Otis won the WWE title. As far as this one is concerned, however, they'll always remain what could have been. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.